take it from there. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Is that all right?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, fabulous. So as you probably would have read from the abstract, what I'm going to share with you today is the findings from a kind of follow-up to an original research study which I conducted in 2010. The original study was for my doctoral research, and the objective of that was to understand the lived experiences of children working in small-scale mining. And this was at a small-scale mining site in Kenyasi, a rural district in the middle belt of Ghana. Now, my sort of opening argument is the point that a lot of claims are made around the long-term impacts of children's work, some of which suggest that the effects are detrimental, some say they aren't. There is a lot of debate around this issue for sure. However, an observation around this is the real depth, the limited sort of longitudinal research on children's work. So a kind of follow-on study which takes a very, I think the Young Lives project has done a fantastic work on this, but certainly there is scope, there is the need for more of these sorts of studies. And I'm not saying this is one of them, but for sure the interest was to find out what had happened to a group of 57 young people who had shared with me their reasons for working in an occupation deemed to constitute a worst form of child labor, and which the ILO has said there should be no justification, poverty included, for children to be involved in. This project sits within a much larger study, which is looking at notions of freedom among marginalized communities in Ghana, Brazil, and elsewhere. And so this project was intended to try to understand how people who are deemed to be living in conditions that are classified in some discourses as forms of modern slavery understand their own situation. And Kenyasi was the place where this broader study was being conducted. So it was a very convenient way of trying to follow up on the sort of outcomes of the young people who told me back in 2010 that they were working in small-scale mining as a means of paying for their education, pursuing apprenticeships, and for some it was just a matter of just being able to take care of themselves, and for others it was about attaining independence as young people. The ages of the participants at the time was mainly 13 years to 17. So in July 2022, then I was in Kenyasi. Now for kind of time purposes, I will just quickly move on to the findings. But I just wanted to say that perhaps one of the challenges with doing studies of this kind, i.e. re-studies, is the question of whether one would be able to trace young people in the first place, or indeed the original participants. And that was a challenge indeed, because although the town hadn't changed geographically, and in fact, I had managed to keep in touch with people in the area following the original research in 2010. It was still a challenge trying to find many of them. At the end, I did manage to locate 12, in part through a snowballing approach, and also because, as I will be explaining later, one of the problems that people in this area face is limited opportunities for socio-spatial mobility. So at the end, I was able to find 12 of the participants, and a guiding or three key guiding questions that informed my interactions with participants was well, first of all, for the broader project, whether these participants were still in the area, because of the 57 original participants, I think 34 were young child migrants who had moved to Kenya, say, from other parts of Ghana in search of work. And so I was interested in finding out whether these young child migrants managed to go back to their places of origin or whether they'd remained in the area, but also for those who were living in the area, what their living circumstances were, and whatever they were, whether they were in a better place or worse than when I met them in 2010, the extent to which they attribute their current circumstances to the fact that they were involved in a job which was or which is classed as a worst form of child labor. So just to clarify, the interest was not in kind of the kind of health outcomes, for instance, which is also very important because one of the arguments about abolishment of children's work in small scale mining is the fact that they are exposed to hazardous chemicals and others. And so it's also worth looking at, I argue, but for practical purposes, for other reasons, this project was mainly interested in their living circumstances, their socioeconomic situations at the current time, and whatever these were, the extent to which the participants associated their living circumstances with the fact that they were involved in small-scale mining back in their childhoods. So as I indicated, 12 now adults from the original study were identified. I managed to make contact with them. 4 of these young people were still involved in small-scale mining work. And so one of the reasons for their continued involvement are manifold. One of them, John, for instance, told me that he had decided to sacrifice himself, as he put it, for the benefit of his family. At the time I met him, he was working to pursue his education, but he explains that following the fieldwork, his mother had an accident. His mother was the main breadwinner for the family. And so he decided to, well, he had to take up the role of the family's breadwinner, which meant that he had to continue working. He had to drop out of school and continue working. That I've explained in publications from that time. A lot of both children and adults see small-scale mining work or are attracted to small-scale mining work because there are low barriers to entry, and it is one of the few jobs that one can conceivably expect to be able to earn enough money, from which one could earn enough money to take care of themselves and their families. And so he had remained in small-scale mining for this reason. Another man, Abu, told me that he also gave up on his education because, he used a kind of local term, his head was dead. He felt that school was simply not for him. He had failed all his tests. He had been repeated, or he made to repeat this year, I think, for 3 years in a row, because the teachers were simply not convinced that he could be he could progress. And he had decided that continuing to throw his hard-earned money, as he put it, at senior high school education was not of any value to him, and he would rather therefore stay as he had done in small-scale mining. One of the young migrants whom I'd met in 2010, Martin, one of the few who had remained in the area, told me that unlike many of his peers with whom he'd traveled from northern Ghana as part of a north-south young migration trend, he had come to the south, or the middle belt rather, looking for work, and had decided that, he'd found work. He saw artisanal gold mining work as a kind of future job prospect and have therefore remained in it. Now, all of these four boys, I've got three quotes from them on the screen, but there are four of them. All four of them at the time of meeting them in June 2022 were in very desperate socioeconomic conditions, in large part because the government had recently, well, since 2017, clamped down on small-scale mining work in Ghana, owing to increasing destruction of rivers and water bodies from this activity, mainly in the eastern part of the country. But I think this has affected small-scale mining in all other parts, and so very often military personnel will kind of swoop down onto these mining sites, destroy the workers' equipment, arrest some, extort some, and so on and so forth. Many of them indeed had ended up in prison after having been arrested for violating the criminalization of small-scale mining or mining without a license. And so they were working very clandestinely and therefore not able to perform as efficiently as they had expected, and therefore living in very kind of desperate situations, as it were, pretty much subsistence hand to mouth and not having any savings or any major kind of socioeconomic security. Of the eight then, one, Amma, who was a young girl I'd met, had trained as a teacher. She'd managed to complete her education through earnings from small-scale mining work and was now a trained teacher. And she felt quite strongly about the fact that whatever she managed to achieve to date was due to the fact that she put herself through education. Because like many of the young people I met back in 2010, because education wasn't free at the time, senior high school education was not free. If your parents could not afford it, you simply drop out of school, or you found a way of paying for it, which was what she was doing then. And she was therefore very, very insistent on the fact that sacrificing, again, the notion of sacrifice was one that came up consistently in these conversations. Sacrificing, as she said, to pay, to work in what is a precarious job to pay for her education, had helped her to become a trained teacher, one of the trained teachers in the area. Unfortunately for four others who had also completed, they were now unemployed and feeling very bitter about their situation. They felt that basically they'd been sold a lie, as Adam told me. You know, he had spent all his money on senior high school education, and he'd failed his final exam, and therefore could not continue either to teacher training, or any of the other tertiary or educational options. Janet had completed, but again could not afford to continue and was also unemployed. And both were very disillusioned for this reason about education. They felt that, you know, they were questioning whether they had done the right thing in even going, or whether they should have found something else altogether to do. Three other boys, John, Kofi, and Adu, had taken up a new kind of employment arena, which had just cropped up in the area, the driving of motor taxis or tuk-tuks. So all three of them had managed to secure or purchase these motors through earnings from small-scale mining work. Because again, this was all part of the discourse around it, as a precarious sort of hazardous job. And so in a bid to exit this job, they bought these motors, which they were using for commercial purposes. The problem is that it's also, I would say, an equally hazardous engagement, if not even more so than small-scale mining, because as I have tried to show there on the screen, many of these drivers don't have licenses, there's no insurance, there's nothing. They drive without any protection. Accidents are very common. And I think there was a recent media report that there are at least 500 of these accidents per day in Ghana, many of which are fatal. And so they had left small scale mining and were again positive about the fact that they'd managed to make this step from that occupation into motor driving through the earnings they'd earned from small scale mining. But again, they hadn't progressed socioeconomically speaking because they were still in a very precarious occupation. Adu had two accidents with his motorbike. He's had to buy the bike twice. On one of these occasions, the bike actually caught fire and burned. And so after nearly 12 years of having met them, of the data from when I met them, it seemed as if Amma was the only one of the 12 young people who had made kind of major progress from the time of meeting them. Now, those who were still in small scale mining did not necessarily feel that it had held them back. They were very sort of angry is the word I would use with the clamp down because they felt they were doing well. And indeed, one of them, Abu, for instance, had purchased a taxi for his younger brother from working in small scale mining. This taxi was and the story around it is for another conversation, but he found himself in a position where he had succeeded, relatively speaking, based on the work he was doing. And now he finds himself back in square one. All his savings had been eroded after nearly 3 years of the small scale mining clamp down. So to bring my talk to an end, what I kind of argue from these findings from this very small scale project is the fact that there seems to be a revolving door of precarity among the young people who were involved in the project. Now, a less critical reading of the problem would probably say, well, it was because they were involved in artisanal mining as a young, child, because then kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, almost as if because they worked in small scale mining, their progress has been stymied or curtailed. They did not feel that at all. For them, and indeed looking at the wider socioeconomic context, it's obvious that opportunities for socio-spatial mobility are still very limited in the area. Those who had successfully completed secondary school, many of them had to take up jobs that did not necessarily match up with the amounts they've spent on education and had taken up farming and others which did not require going to, in their eyes anyway, going to senior high school. And in the context of COVID-19 and the worsening socioeconomic landscape in the country, I found a new group of children, young people, also now going to work at the mining site, just as these adults had done 10 years ago. So it is clear that not much had changed. The same problems exist, the same challenges, the lack of opportunities which had driven the original participants to the site were still driving many more young people to the same space. And to conclude, I think it's clear that we have a real problem where we are concerned about children. We romanticize childhood, we agonize about lack of opportunities for children, but somehow these concerns tend to disappear when people are about 18, which is one of the issues that my young people were highlighting that, when they were working at the site, there was a lot of media reports and, campaigns to disengage children from this activity. Now that they had left, even though their circumstances had not improved, it's almost as if nobody was interested in them again, even though they are still in a very bad place, socioeconomically speaking. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sam. Would you mind giving us the just the questions that you had prepared for a possible chat before we go to the more general Q&A, but just so that we already have them in our minds?
Yes, sure. I will pull them up in a minute. I have them all on my screen.
I will also share them in the chat.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was just going to do that. No, you don't.
Okay. Go ahead, Michael.
I've got it.
Okay. Should I paste them in the chat, the questions?
I've just pasted them in the chat.
Oh, you have, Richard. Thank you very much. It's very helpful.